Welcome to the Journal of the Southwest Radio Hour. This episode is a counterpart to our episode from November diving into land management practices and invasive species in the northern Sonoran Desert. Through interviews with 3 practitioners of Indigenous cultural preservation, it brings in wider-ranging ideas about the philosophy and purpose of land management, as controlling the spread of invasive plants is just one part of preserving species relationships. Our first interview is with Karl Hoerig, who works in historic preservation for the Pascua Yaqui Nation. In this role, he reviews proposed development projects for adherence to the National Historic Preservation Act, which mandates consultation with tribal nations who have ties to the land where these projects are proposed.
My name is Karl Hoerig. I am the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pascua Yaqui Tribe. The Yaqui people recognize a traditional homescape that extends from extreme northern Sinaloa through the state of Sonora, extending into Baja California and Alta California, and across the Sierra Madre into Chihuahua, and then including pretty much all of the state of Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and I already mentioned California. That was the area that ancestral Yaqui people moved in, traded, exchanged, lived in different areas. There are now 8 sacred pueblos that are on the lower Rio Yaqui River, which is in Sonora, between Guaymas and Ciudad Obregón. We know of Yaqui communities that existed in Arizona prior to the coming of the Spaniards. The Rio Yaqui actually has its headwaters in the Chiricahua Mountains here in Arizona. Actually, the name Chiricahua is a Yaqui and Opata word for Turkey Mountain. And so that's the larger landscape that we see. Now, during the more recent historic period, there are Yaqui communities that extend from Scottsdale and the Phoenix area through central Arizona between Phoenix and Tucson. And now we have communities in Tucson with Old Pascua, and there's also a strong Yaqui community in what we call Barrio Libre in South Tucson area. The first reservation lands were established for the Pascua Yaqui tribe, southwest of Tucson proper, set aside for the Yaqui people starting in the 1960s. It's a sort of a complicated history for the tribal community here, but we have 9 tribally recognized communities in Arizona now, in addition to some other communities that have concentrations of Yaqui folks and names, but aren't recognized as official communities. Now, I do try to make a distinction when talking about the work that I do and the work that the Department of Language and Culture does, and other folks that are doing organized cultural and language perpetuation work. We talk about Yaqui people, or Yaqui, rather than Pascua Yaqui, because Pascua Yaqui really is just a legal designation. And so that's something that's sort of evolved as the Pascua Yaqui tribe has developed as a legal entity, but folks don't necessarily call themselves Pascua Yaqui. They recognize that they are Yaqui, or more properly, Yaqui.
Protecting cultural and historic resources often includes ancestral places, sometimes referred to as archaeological sites. But it also means preserving the complex landscapes within the Yaqui's extensive homeland and the species that share them.
We're having to work hard and as closely as we can with federal agencies and folks that are doing development to try to find a balance for the establishment of large-scale solar arrays, for example, that take up lots and lots of acreage. And we're trying to work with those proponents to find ways that they can avoid the places that are most important, the ancestor places and other resources that are irreplaceable. Part of my mandate from the tribe, from the tribal council, is to support other efforts to preserve and perpetuate Yaqui cultural activities. And so we've been working with area land managers to figure out ways that we can help to reestablish and support the riparian plant communities. So we're working with Pima County, particularly on the Santa Cruz, and other agencies, both nonprofits and governmental agencies. There are a number of plant species that are culturally important to the Yaqui community that are used for various purposes. And so what I am doing is trying to support the preservation and the perpetuation of these plant communities. We have a real issue with the way that the salt cedars have been invasive in the riparian areas, and so one of the things we look at is partnering with others to try to limit the presence and the spread of those invasive tamarisks, and to provide opportunities for the plants that were here historically to return. Of course, we have all issues as well with, like everybody else, with invasive grasses, with the buffalo grass and fountain grass that's coming in, and are looking at ways that we can help to mitigate the presence of those plants, partly because of the fire danger that they present, and partly because of the fact that they do tend to push out the cohort of indigenous plants. In terms of the riparian plants, what are most important and what we're working at most diligently is to protect and to reestablish populations of cottonwoods, known in Yaqui as abaso, and also Gooding's willow, which is in Yaqui is known as wata. Those are both used for they have significant cultural use during the tribe's ceremonial seasons. There's a lot of other plants that are important culturally that go in there, but in terms of what we're looking at, we're starting with these trees. One of the things that we're experimenting with now, that we're actually learning a lot from the Gila River Indian community, is looking at engaging in pole planting of cottonwoods and willows. And so that is essentially taking dormant stems from existing plants during the wintertime and preparing them and then planting them. Certainly, we support and encourage folks to use plants that are indigenous to this area, not to bring in invasive species or non-native species that might become invasive. We very well may in the future establish a nursery or growing operations for the cottonwoods and the willows that are important, and some other species that are important culturally that are not as easy to find these days. My office, at least, is supportive of efforts that are being taken by a variety of organizations to see, for example, how they can support the perpetuation of saguaro cacti by planting in environments that are becoming better for saguaros as the lower elevation places are becoming less suitable for them.
Longtime stewards of this region also include O'odham peoples. Jacelle Ramon-Sauberan's life work involves understanding and propagating her community's historic practices for cultivating this landscape and thriving within its ecosystems.
Skugdash, Wishajamoy, Aniap Jiggy, Dr. Jacelle Ramon-Sauberan Chapwalk, Amajid. So good day, everyone. My name is Dr. Jacelle Ramon-Sauberan. I come from the Sanavir community on the Tohono O'odham Nation. I wear many different hats. I do all sorts of different things. I'm an educator, I'm a scholar. Full-time, I work for NOR Lab, closely working with Kip Peak National Observatory. I'm the Tohono O'odham Nation Education Development Liaison. So in a nutshell, I'm the bridge person between my tribe, the Tohono O'odham Nation, and the observatory, because the observatory sits within one of our parcels that makes up the 2.8 million acres of the Tohono O'odham Nation, and the observatory also is atop one of our sacred mountains, Iogam Duwag. When I'm not working at Kit Peak, I do teach at Tohono O'odham Community College within the Tohono O'odham Studies program, and I teach O'odham history, culture, foodways, So I have all three of my degrees are from the University of Arizona, and my master's and my PhD are both in American Indian Studies. And I graduated last May 2023 with my PhD, and I wrote about the history of land and water in the Santa Fe community, and created this living document with help, of course, from my community. Even though my name's on it, it was really a community effort. It's the start of my lifelong work and all the different things that I want to do and be able to do for my community and to help others, and also to just give people a better understanding, of what has transpired within American Indian history eras. Also, too, what we've done to like stand up for what we believe in, and again, just even like telling people who we are. The Tohono O'odham Nation is located in the southwest in southern Arizona, and altogether we have 4 parcels that were designated at different times, so parcels of land. Those 4 parcels are in different areas and they're not connected. So the first parcel that was designated is where I come from, Santa Fe, and that was in 1874. Talking a little bit more about history, and so for the O'odham, we do have our sister tribes. Before contact, we were all just one. O'odham means people. So, we were living in our family clusters along the Santa Cruz River, the Gila River, the Salt River, San Pedro River, which is east of Tucson. When we had contact with Spaniards, especially a Jesuit priest by the name of Father Eusebio Kino, he started to give us different names. So that's why today we have Tohono O'odham, Gila River Pima, Salt River Pima Maricopa, Ak-Chin. Those 4 are all federally recognized tribes in the United States. And then we have Hiachit O'odham. They're not recognized, but they are a group, or if you want to like kind of describe it as a band of O'odham. So, but we call ourselves sister tribes. So obviously our ancestral lands were much larger. We lived in an enormous area of land here in the Southwest, which extended south to Sonora, Mexico, north to um, central Arizona, just kind of just past Phoenix, west to the Gulf of California, and east to the San Pedro River. And, we were always traveling around, to collect our materials for basket making, pottery, or even when we would do our wild harvesting, depending on where within the land you lived, you could have 2 homes, a winter home and then a spring summer home. So we moved with the land, and always making sure that we knew where our resources were. There's certain areas where you go to collect materials like willow. There's certain areas where you go to be able to collect the saguaro fruit. We were really smart about knowing our land, right? And knowing where to go. And certainly also too knowing where the rivers were and living along the rivers as well, and being able to divert water from these rivers into our farm fields, into our communities, and then diverting it back. And so we only took what we needed, because there's others like birds and insects and coyotes and javelina and deer, that need these resources too. So knowing that we're sharing, since we're made from the land, or as we see in O'odham, the Jugurga, we have this deep connection rooted in us to the plants, to the seasons. And so being mindful of all of these different things that make us who we are today as O'odham, though. And even though our lands have reduced in size from ancestral to what we have today, we are really fortunate that we've never been removed from our ancestral lands. We have always remained where our creator Iatoi and others, when they came together to create human beings, we are where Iatoi put us, and we will always be here.
O'odham lifeways were profoundly disrupted by the arrival of European settlers in the late 1600s. Disturbances that began with catastrophic loss of life through the introduction of disease and displacement evolved over time, manifesting in many different forms over the expansion of the American project. Land privatization marked a major change for many Indigenous communities who underwent allotment processes, including some O'odham, whose lands were divided and reassigned by the federal government decades before Arizona became a state in the Union.
So as part of my dissertation research, I wanted to make sure that, yes, we were talking about specific events happening in Sanavir, but also to wanting people to understand, kind of like taking a step back and understanding kind of these broader events that happen within Indian country. And one of those was the Dawes Act, also known as the allotment era. The only parcel of the Tohono O'odham Nation that went through allotment was Sanavir. And it was because Sanavir was the only reservation that was established at that time. So Sanavir was established as an Indian reservation in 1874. Then the Dawes Act was passed in 1887, and Sanavir went through allotment in 1890, 3 years after it was passed. And since it was an assimilation attempt to civilize us into, kind of what we should be, ranchers, farmers, or harvesters of timber. And for us, it was just mostly coming in and dividing up our land and introducing this idea of individualism, which we didn't know what that term meant, because we're communal, there's relationality. We're making sure everybody has enough food. We're making sure everybody's healthy. We're taking care of each other, right? That's what a community does. And so we went through allotment. And if you were O'odham and you were in Sanavir on the day that allotments were handed out, you just got in line and got an allotment. So, we have families today that are from other parts of the Tohono O'odham Nation that have land or interest, I should say, in land within Sanavir. And not everybody from Sanavir has say in the land. It's really interesting, and it's complex, and it's it's a bit complicated when you talk about it. That was kind of a big part of why I did my research on the history of land and water in Sanavir, was understanding what does it mean to be an allottee, and also too, it was a foreign concept to us to be landowners, because our creator Iatoi put us on this land, on this earth, to be caretakers. And so, if you can kind of sit with that for a minute and think about it, after everything was said and done, and we all had the essentially piece of paper saying, you're the landowner, allottee of, parcel, whatever, number. There was, we just kind of didn't see it as anything major, because we just went right back to farming. And it wasn't till way down the road that we realized how important being a landowner was, and being able to stand up at different times to fight for our land and our water. And, I am a future allottee landowner. You can't talk about the present and plan for the future if you don't know the history. It feels good once you have that better understanding, right, of the history and what's transpired, being able to have a seat at the table for these discussions. We've had some climate change community events, and also to our natural resources department within the Sanavir district. They're doing more and more within the community and with our youth. The really cool thing too is that our elders, they're our knowledge keepers, and so I was able to, have many of their voices heard within my paper, and my research, and just learning from them, in the interviews is amazing. To the connections that we have with the plants, with the animals, like just with our whole landscape. Certainly we also pay attention to the seasons, and right now, heading into the winter months, is when we do our storytelling. Funny stories or serious stories, and there's also stories that, which are my favorite, talk about how things came to be, and how we got, like, say for example, different foods, right? But one of the main stories that is always told is our creation story, and how we have his name is Juad Makai, Earthmaker, how he made the earth, how he made the plants, the mountains, the stars, the moon, the sun, like all of these different things, right? And so part of that story is also talking about how human beings were created. And so there's animals that are part of those stories, and coyote and buzzard were there to help create people. And in O'odham, coyote is ban for singular. For buzzard, we call him nuh. These are foundational beings that were there to, again, create people. But regardless if you're a human, you're a plant, you're a cactus, you're an animal, we're all coexisting here, and we all have a purpose. And so, since we're talking about coyote, anytime I talk about coyote in stories, I still talk to coyotes if I see them, passing me, and at least even just acknowledging them like I would anybody else, right? But again, I could keep going and going, but just to kind of give you an idea of how that coexisting happens, our respect that we have for animals, and how important they are to us.
The San Javier O'odham community, like all manner of their desert neighbors, had long structured their lives around the nearby Santa Cruz River. But by the middle of the 20th century, it was exhausted by mining, agribusiness operations, and unfettered development. In 1982, the Tohono O'odham won a lawsuit affirming their right to water on their land. The resulting legislation enabled the San Javier Co-op Farm to preserve cultural and environmental values while feeding their community. The farm remains one example of O'odham adaptiveness to disturbances in ecological systems.
When it comes to our food systems, our traditional ecological knowledge, there have been times where that's been threatened. All the amazing things that they've done, at the farm to keep our traditional ecological knowledge alive, to continue to plant and harvest and share our traditional foods. I don't know, how many people really think about this, but it really started to pop up when I was doing my PhD work, and even before I started my dissertation research. But it was just how, again, we've adapted over time, and how we've been able to balance the different things that have been thrown at us, first of all with what everything we're discussing, but also too things that were introduced to us. So when Father Eusebio Kino, who was a Jesuit priest, came, he was sent by Spain to come convert, as many O'odham native indigenous people as he could to Catholicism. He also brought, tools and different foods that we never knew about. Also, too, like cattle and horses. But with these foods that he introduced to us, like wheat and fruit trees. So thinking about how we've been able to, again, adapt. we have that, the non-traditional and the traditional, and been able to find a way to be able to balance that all and grow all of them. I always tell people that for autumn, there was assimilation that happened, but for the most part, we learned to adapt. So, we're doing our best to keep our food systems alive. And one of the foods, I guess you could say, are plants that we're, um, most connected to is saguaro. In Autumn, we call it hashan, or plural, we say hahashan. And we harvest the fruit that come out in or bloom in the summertime, and it's medicine to our bodies. And we have a ceremony that takes place, and this is all done prior to the monsoon rains that come afterward. So as I've gotten older, it's been really interesting to kind of take a step back and look at, it's not like we just go out and harvest the fruits, and there's so much more to it, of giving a thanks. And that could even be like in singing a song in our Othamniok, our language, to the Saguaros. Then we're out with our family, community, friends, harvesting. Then you make the foods. You can also eat it raw. And then from there, you have the ceremony. And, it's also too our time of renewal and celebration as we welcome our new year. So there's so many moving parts to that harvest. And other foods that we harvest are cholla buds from the cholla cactus. And then, there's all sorts of other things too. We have like wild spinach that grows in the desert too, that people go, wow, really, spinach? It's like, yeah. We have wild onions too, like, just these different foods that, if you know where to go to find them, are foods you can go and harvest every year.
Conservation is about preserving not just the land, but the practices and rhythms that evolved within it. Humans have always influenced this ecosystem, forming their own relationships with key species like the saguaro cactus, which plays a crucial role in sustaining desert life. From those who feed on its fruit and seeds, to woodpeckers, owls, sparrows, and hawks that nest within its cavities, the saguaro supports an entire network of life. Raeshaun Ramon works to support these relationships within the largest concentration of these cacti in the world, at Saguaro National Park.
Ania Jigik Raeshaun Ramon, Ania Namjad Wawakiwajikshan. Good day, my name is Raeshaun Ramon, and I come from a small village called Artesia and Little Tucson within the Barbecue District on the Tohono O'odham Nation. Currently, I work at Saguaro National Park in the Community Engagement Outreach and Tribal Support Division, where I primarily focus on working within the community of Tucson and tribal communities around. We talk a lot about the park and the park's resources and how the community can get involved, but also in return getting the community back to the park as well, as national parks are usually filled with people from all over the world that are coming to see the saguaros and learn about our park resources. But what we're mainly trying to do is trying to get the local community into the park as well. I think the community has a lot of local knowledge that they could bring to the park. I really like to mainly focus more on the cultural resources of the park, about my ancestors, the Hohokam, which translates to those who came before us. I really like to share that cultural knowledge with the people that visit the park. The park holds so much cultural significance and history, and a lot of times the community is not aware. Sometimes I usually have people, usually elders, that kind of come up to me and talk to me like, oh, I remember this particular area or this particular mountain within the park, has an O'odham name, or they talk about how there's a traditional story associated with the mountain range, and talk about the different plants within the park too that are used for different purposes within our community, like basketry or medicinal usage. What kind of got me into archaeology was my grandfather, because in the village that I'm from, Artesia, we have a lot of archaeological sites within the community. And at the time growing up, I wasn't really aware of it. I knew that there was like little pottery sherds here and there and little grinding stones, but it wasn't until like my grandfather actually took me out into the desert and he would show me these different things. And he always talked about like this is you know the evidence of your ancestors. These are our relatives right here. And as I got older, I started to be more involved within my own cultural background, where I started to learn some of the traditional stories, the songs, and kind of learning my role in the community, where I learned how important it is to be proud of my cultural heritage. I heard a bit about Saguaro National Parks when I was a kid. I knew that people would go there to hike, but also traditionally, often people would go to the west district of the park, which is also known as Tucson Mountain District, where they would harvest the traditional saguaro fruit. But at the time, too, I was always told stories about how community members were not welcome into that space. And so that kind of just stuck with me that whole time. When I started as an intern, I didn't really share a lot with my community. That's where I worked, just because of the history associated with national parks and indigenous communities, but also particularly within my own community as well. But then as I was there a lot longer, I realized that there's nobody like me within these roles at the park. And so I was like, I think I could see myself here and actually telling my own perspective. Growing up in a traditional upbringing, I think I could, bring a lot to the park and kind of share that knowledge from my community into these spaces, so people can learn about, who we are as O'odham people and how we still exist, just like many other people, many other indigenous communities all over the country, and their relationships to those national parks. Once I had the opportunity to be a permanent ranger at Saguaro National Park, I had to really take a step back and think about it, because like I said, I just had so much, there was a dilemma between my cultural background and then working, for a federal government. But like at the time, like I was asking people if I should do this. And, one of the community members said, it's about time that we have an O'odham in uniform, bringing a lot to at Sonoran National Park. And so now that the work that I do is get to, continue doing that continue doing that work with the community, but also wear the green and gray uniform with a flat hat. That was a real significant part of my journey as well. Me being out in the park where I get to hike, where I get to observe every little particular plant, branch, or even a rock, and seeing some of the animals that in the park too, it really changed my whole perspective on what it means to be an O'odham in a desert. It's very comforting, and I can understand why like my ancestors chose this place.
According to the National Park Service, the mission of Saguaro National Park is to preserve its piece of the Sonoran Desert for the enjoyment of this and future generations. This includes monitoring and protecting the natural, cultural, and historic resources within it.
Arizona has 3 national parks: Grand Canyon National Park, Petrified Forest National Park, and our very own Saguaro National Park. Saguaro National Park is separated by 2 districts, and the reason why is because Tucson separates both districts. And it was established in order to protect the saguaros, just because it's so unique to this area. In 1933, when the east side was established, they didn't really understand how saguaros grow and like how like saguaros are very important to its surroundings. And during that time, they allowed cattle grazing, which eventually they found out that the cattle grazing actually depleted the soils in those areas, but also it took away a lot of the baby saguaros where they were being stomped on. And then, but also the trees, they start to die, even the shrubs in that area. They would see a lot of that damage being done in the desert. And so what they did was establish a west side in 1961, where the west side now has the most saguaro cacti in the world. For both districts, they have about 2.1 million saguaros. The saguaros are very sacred to the Tohono O'odham people as relatives that have passed on. And, not only that too, but that saguaro plays a huge cultural factor within our community. It wasn't until when I started working here I viewed them differently because I get to learn not just the traditional aspects of saguaros, but also the ecological benefits of it too. Saguaros are a keystone species to this environment. The saguaros provide so much for the plants and animals, and that goes same for my community. Because like that, we view the saguaros very sacred. Without that saguaro, I feel like we wouldn't have this strong cultural heritage within my community. And like that, without the saguaro, I feel like there won't be the O'odham people here. Yeah, so I get to bring both worlds together and kind of enhance, that knowledge. We get many visitors coming to the park every day, and it's a chance for me to share who I am and why we protect saguaros and why it's so important.
There is no one-size-fits-all approach to land management, and discussions around invasive species can oversimplify the issue. It's important to contextualize conservation efforts in essential historical understandings. 1. That there is no such thing as terra nullius, nor virgin landscape. This continent was actively managed and influenced by native people when settlers arrived, despite attempts to erase that relationship within narratives that undergird the national park movement itself. Likewise, flattening all diverse human activities into a single force and removing it from the land does not equate to restoration. Some human actions, beginning with colonization, have caused disproportionate and rapid changes that have created conditions for invasive species to prosper. But perhaps the real question isn't even about restoring the land. Maybe it's more about healing our relationship to it. Ecology encompasses an intricate and dynamic set of connections which are always evolving. It inherently includes humans and their foodways, and its changes are really difficult to predict and to manage. Framing the invasives conversation as a battle between good and bad species, especially based on returning to a set point in the ecological past, overlooks complexity and limits our ability to envision the future. Being a species of immense ecological and cultural importance, the saguaro cactus offers a compelling case study in changing human-environment relationships and ideas around land management.
They wanted to protect those areas from people as they saw a lot of development of housings in that area, roads. I think at the beginning they wanted to, what they call, I'm putting air quotations, pristine landscape and keep it natural as they can be. But I think over time they realized that, they're trying to take away that history from those indigenous people. Especially here at Saguaro National Park, taking away that history. But like that too, you can't separate the two. I think they're all one. And today, there are a lot more stories being told from these communities in order to talk about the landscape. Conservation, it means a lot to different people. Like I said, sometimes people think that nobody should be in these areas. And then when I ask that same question about conservation within tribal communities, they talked about how they need access to these areas in order to make sure that the landscape's healthy. When they harvest the saguaro fruit, they use what we call a koi bud, meaning harvesting pole. We pull down the fruit, and when we pull down the fruit, and we actually take the fruit from the peel, we'll actually leave the peel right below where the saguaro is standing. And then over time, as it decomposes, those nutrients from that peel will actually go back into the soil and actually go back into the landscape. And it kind of gives nutrients to that saguaro and whatever plants surrounding it. And so we're going back to conservation. For indigenous communities, they talk about having access to these areas in order to, like that, keep that system healthy. But like I said, I think Saguaro National Park was all about just talking about the landscape in that sense, separate from people. But nowadays, they realize that they need people in these landscapes in order to tell these stories. When the West District was established, that had the most highest density of saguaros in that area, but the O'odham community already knew that. And that's why they were always in those certain areas, which is now the national park. But they would actually build what we call harvest camps, and where they would actually camp out in the desert, and whatever particular time of the year, usually for the saguaro fruit season, they will stay there for a couple weeks to a month and getting the fruit. They would process the fruit there in order to make the syrup. But they didn't just collect the saguaro fruit. They used the camps to collect prickly pear fruit, the cholla buds, and different gathering materials as well, such as for pottery. I've heard some O'odham families actually going into that area and finding clay deposits and getting that and making pottery. But like I said, once it was established as a national monument in 1961, there was a lot of pushback from the park to the communities where they were trying to separate people from the landscape. And so over time, that kind of turned people away. And then a lot of these camps that were built, they start to fall apart. And eventually, it kind of went back to the landscape. But you'll find fragments of certain poles here and there. And so that's what kind of happened over the years. It wasn't until, I guess, there was one particular family that was kind of very strong in their stance in making sure that they have access to that area was Juanita Hill, who was from the community of Little Tucson. And every summer, she would actually go out to where her harvest camp is. At the time, it was just on the outside of the park. And so she would build her camp there, her and her family, and then she would go harvest up in the mountains. She was very strong in doing so and making that, her stance. They allowed it, the Rangers, but they were still trying to find ways to stop the harvest, not just from her family, but other families that were still trying to come back to as well. It wasn't until Stuart and Morris Udall sided with Juanita and her family in making sure that they can continue to harvest the fruit within the park. And then eventually, with all that support, they were able to. The park allowed, her and her family to come out to harvest, but there was actually no proper documentation during that time. It wasn't until in the 90s where they end up giving Juanita a permit, basically. And that permit basically allows her to have a fire within the park. But it wasn't until the early 2000s where they ended up having an agreement between the Tohono O'odham Nation and Saguaro National Park, creating this agreement allowing all tribal members under this one document to harvest the saguaro fruit, prickly pear, and cholla buds. So you can see this progress between that one permit to Juanita Hill and her family, and then to having an agreement between tribal leadership and Saguaro National Park. And like that, since her passing, Juanita Hill, her daughter Stella Tucker, took over the camp. Stella was very open to the public and educating anyone really to come out there and learn about the fruit and learning about the tradition of it. Not just teaching people about this tradition, but she's also educating them on how important it is to protect these sacred plants. And then in 2019, she passed away. Her daughter Tanisha Tucker and her cousin Maria Francisco took over that camp. And so now it's still being run by the same family. And within the park, there's only one active harvest camp, which is the Tucker camp. And so the relationship between, the nation and the park is slowly becoming this great benefit. But however, there's still a lot of people that don't understand why is a national park established here and why they're still protecting these sites that are still hurt from being pushed away in those areas. But then like that too, I think I go into these communities and I talk about these certain things and the documentation and that agreement between the park and the community. And so a lot of times community members didn't know that there was an agreement. And it's just funny because I had this one particular elder say, yeah, it's I remember when I tried going harvesting with my family, we were yelled at, she said, by visitors. And then that whole time, like, she just didn't feel welcomed. And it wasn't until like when she saw me and she asked me where I worked, and I told her about like the history of it and how it is now. And then she felt good that somebody within her community is working there. And for the past 3 years that I've been working at the park, every year I see more and more families out in the park harvesting the saguaro fruit, or out harvesting the prickly pear and cholla buds. And so I think it's at a steady pace in building those relationships up, but I know there's still so much to do between the park and the tribe, especially with the limited amount of staff and native staff on the team. It can be somewhat of a burden at times, just because like there's a lot of times where I reflect. I was like, why do I have to be the first one within my community to work here? There's so much important history that it has, within the park. It can be very challenging, but at the same time, I do have hopes because I can see that progress. I always ask my community, like, what do you want to see? A lot of them will say it's just like seeing more O'odham folks or more native folks within the park. And oftentimes, when I bring folks out, they say that I haven't been here since I was a kid, or they say I've never been here at all. And they always say that I will come back. I will come back. I'll bring my family. I'll bring them out to these places. That makes me feel really good about the work that I do, and like that, sharing that knowledge with them. And I always tell them, like, I'll be here if you need me. But also, one particular thing is that with the harvest camp, community member said she would like to see more harvest camps in the park. When I heard that, I kind of just smiled really big, and I was just like, I think I could make that a goal of mine in the near future. I know it's going to take time, but I think with the support of the community and the park, I think that can happen. With the resources management team, they're always studying saguaros. Lately, they've done a phenology project where they noticed that saguaros, the flowering, start from the east side. Flowers start popping up on the arm counterclockwise. And so far, that's the only plant that they know of that does that. And once they told me that information, once I found out that information, I started smiling because I kind of already knew that. It was just because, like, in our culture, we do everything counterclockwise too. We do our basketry. When we start our baskets, we always do it counterclockwise. When we do our round dances, we always go in counterclockwise too. Even entering homes is always counterclockwise. And I always feel like we mimic the environment. And I feel like the O'odham people already knew that the flowers do that. And it's funny to me sometimes where I get to see, like, oh, we discovered this. And then, for Indigenous people all over the world, they kind of like, oh, we already knew that. And you're just not figuring that out.
Like elsewhere in the Sonoran Desert, Saguaro National Park is dealing with the spread of harmful invasive species under intensifying climate change conditions.
So in order for saguaros to grow, they need what they call a nurse plant. When a saguaro grows, they grow under either like a bush or a tree in order to protect it from the elements and everything else. I think with the resources management team, they are very aware about the invasive species, especially with buffalo grass and the newer invasive species, steepnet. They do a lot in trying to not necessarily get rid of it, but to maintain it, because they know they can't get rid of it. It's just in so many places, all over the state, really. But within the park too, they're seeing a lot more of that, and it is becoming more of a challenge with the resources there, and particularly saguaros. They are seeing a lot more effects to their nurse plants. Buffalo grass, when they take over these natural spaces, they end up taking the nutrients from the saguaros, especially when they're young, and eventually harming them. But also too, with the fires that come with it, they're not adapted to these very high intensity fires as well. It really is something that can harm this landscape. Think of like an invasive species as basically colonizing this landscape. They kind of just take from the soil. They kind of take those spaces away from native plants, and that's the way I see it. And it does cause a huge, effect on the landscape, and it will in the long run as well. And going back into community, I do talk about invasive species. We really rely on the support of the community of volunteers in order to help us maintain it. There are some ways where we can actually manage it. I think it's just more about being adaptable in this environment and kind of going along with the times. And in doing so, we were always learning new techniques. For us, we just had to be very adaptable. And you've seen that over the years too. People are being very adaptive.
I definitely see that everything that I'm doing, whether it's, within my full-time job at Kit Peak or teaching at the Tohono O'odham Community College, or just things that I do, outside of work, is definitely preservation, cultural, and traditional ecological preservation. And it's important to have these discussions and talk about these different topics, sharing about our himathug, which is our way of life. And then even now in my professional job and everything that I'm doing, and with Kit Peak, the history, it's really interesting because there's all these things that were um decided for us, right? You had federal government coming in and making decisions, thinking they knew what was best for us, but only we know what is best for our people and our community. Tohono O'odham translates to desert people. We've been here for so long, and we will continue to be here for even longer. Our relatives, the animals, and the plants are, we're all coexisting here. We all have this mutual respect for each other, and making sure people hear it from somebody who's from the Tohono O'odham Nation, I think, is even more important. So you're hearing it directly from somebody who lives and breathes it every day.